Hello YouTube and welcome back to the zone where today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to literally do an entire almost history lesson about a musical instrument. Now, if you've ever seen some of my videos on my main channel, Raging Reality, which you should totally check out, by the way, it's awesome. There are an increasing number of groups I've started to review that have started to use this strange instrument called a Hurdy Gurdy. But goodness, I have absolutely no idea what technically I can categorize it as, apart from a musical instrument, or what exactly it is, and where on earth did it come from? Well, literally, just to cut things short, because I know this video is going to be pretty long anyway, let's find out. So let's dive down into the rabbit hole once again. So if you guys want to check out the original video for yourselves, links will all be in the description down below. Let's begin. The Hurdy Gurdy in 3, 2, 1, and... And there it is. Pretty much like a violin with a... Is that I don't know who that's meant to be.
Over the past few decades, the hurdy-gurdy has gained a limited space in public consciousness. Most people have only heard the term in the Donovan song Hurdy Gurdy Man. However, the sound of it will occasionally be discovered by composers who utilize it in order to evoke a rustic, pagan, or piratical ambience, such as in the soundtracks to the show Black Sails and the games The Witcher 3 and Sea of Thieves. However, it usually remains as a curiosity, with its past shrouded in mystery and its mechanics left uncertain. So what exactly is the hurdy-gurdy? This is a question I can answer personally, because I play the instrument. This is a modern hurdy-gurdy, -1 key in for repair. This instrument is arranged in the closest thing to a standard that it has. Some have more strings, some have fewer, but nearly all of them worldwide will be built with this basic structure. The most important part of the instrument is here, the wheel, whose axle is turned by the crank on the side. The wheel bows each of the 6 strings which run the full length of the instrument, and each of these strings may be placed on the wheel or removed at any time. There are 3 different kinds of strings. The first are the drone strings, which are tuned in harmony with one another. There are the bass drones, which are on the far side of the instrument and make a deep, throaty sound. There's also an additional drone on the near side, tuned an octave above the lowest bass. The second kind of string is the trompette, which is perhaps the most unique part of the instrument. When the wheel is turned normally, it acts as another drone, but the bridge for the string is not actually attached to the instrument itself. It's only held in place by the tension of the string. When the string is engaged and the wheel is turned hard enough, it buzzes. By rhythmically jerking the wheel forward, the player can create a beat. The third and final kind of strings are the melody strings, which run through this key chest, come out the other side, and wrap around the tuning pegs. But it's in the key chest that the instrument becomes its most complicated. The keys each poke through the top side of the key chest, and attached to each key are wooden or metal tangents, in this case wood, that make contact with the string when the key is pressed. This works like a fretboard on a guitar, except instead of pushing the string to the fret is pushed to the string, and when released, they slide back down and out of the way. Each of these tangents must be tuned manually, which can be arduous. The keys, due to their rudimentary design, also create a percussive clacking sound every time they're played. Nowadays, the melody strings are often tuned to an octave, which produces a very unique sound. Each string has a small bit of raw, long-strand cotton wrapped around the point where it meets the wheel, both to protect the string from being eaten away and to soften the sound, which is extremely harsh otherwise. All of this comes together to create a sound often compared to a bagpipe, but distinct from it, like so. This complexity means that half of playing the instrument is in its maintenance. Hurdy-gurdists are universally familiar with its inner workings, and tinkering for the right sound is mandatory. Player Barnaby Walters, in his blog article How to Build a Chian, wrote that, in order to play musically and express themselves, a violin player must spend years perfecting their intonation and bowing technique. In contrast, a hurdy-gurdy player achieves much of their sonic expression and stylistic refinement in the selection, preparation, and setup of an instrument, investing time and technical skills before playing to ensure good sound and function. Modern hurdy-gurdies will often add to this basic design. The most common changes are more strings, in the most extreme cases 11 or more, not including sympathetic strings. Other amenities include capos and remote switches for the drones, as well as unique methods of constructing the wheel to resist temperature and humidity changes. Many modern hurdy-gurdies will also include pickups to create what are often called electric hurdy-gurdies, though they are almost universally electroacoustic instruments. No matter how much gets added or changed, and no matter what body type is applied, this instrument has an unmistakably antiquated visage. It looks like an ancient machine. But this implies the question, where did it come from? In the ancient Byzantine Empire and the contemporary Middle East, approximately between 400 and 1000 AD, experimentation with musical instruments continued to produce inventions and contraptions that could better express what the people at the time saw as musical ideals. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, had adopted most of its musical traditions from ancient Greece, and these would often bleed out of its borders and into the surrounding territories. Among these traditions was the ideal of the continuous sound, often accompanying vocals. This ideal was so important that the writer Al-Akfani as-Sahawi, in his early 1300s book self-described as the proper guide for the person striving towards the highest goals, had a section dedicated to the concept of uninterrupted music. He wrote, "Human tones have an effect upon the soul, take hold of it, etc. Then they are interrupted by pauses, which destroy the pleasure." A few different methods have been invented in order to help realize this ideal, largely based around the musical concept of the drone, a single note or chord played or repeated continuously. The Nubians, a people from the Nile Valley, would pluck drones on lyres as they sang. Similarly, the Persian rebob would be plucked as a drone underneath singing, and lutes would provide drones with a free string. Perhaps the most extreme example of this ideal existed in the flutes and other wind instruments of the region. These would frequently include flutes with more than one pipe, and it was common to have at least one pipe that provided a drone. In order to create a continuous sound, the players would practice circular breathing, which allowed them to play even as they inhaled. Using this technique, players would sometimes create uninterrupted music for hours at a time. Numerous automata had been created to realize this musical ideal as well. One was the bagpipe, in which a player would constantly fill a bag under their arm with their breath and squeeze it in order to produce a constant airflow. Though the most well-known in the West may be the Scottish Great Highland bagpipes from the 1400s, a much more ancient form was the tulum in Turkey or the askalos in Greece, both different names for the same instrument. The tulum, like some flutes of the time, had two pipes which could each be played independently. This method was far more accessible in terms of creating continuous sound, omitting the need for circular breathing. Another continuous sound instrument was the water organ, a far more mechanical device which utilized pressure from a higher water source, such as a spring, in order to pump air through pipes played by a keyboard. This required a system to route the water many meters above the instrument itself so it could drop into the mechanism and produce the pressure for the air. Among these instruments, however, was one peculiar and mysterious one which appeared in Persia. Ancient accounts describe a strange mechanical object in which a wheel bowed strings, some of which were shortened by tangents attached to keys, and others which sounded a continuous drone. Apparently with no better name, the writer called this contraption a wheel instrument. While it is believed that this may have been a Persian invention due to the ancient accounts of it, it's not known precisely when or where it was created, as there is so little from the area that has been recovered regarding its presence. However, at the turn of the millennium, this instrument will become an inextricable part of everyday life in Europe, and in a surprising capacity.
It is almost time for you to leave.
711 AD, the Islamic Moors from northern Africa invaded southern Spain and occupied it, installing a new emirate which became a caliphate 200 years later. Though the caliphate would dissolve during the Middle Ages due to perpetual Christian attack and economic pressure, European culture was changed significantly by the Moorish occupiers. Art and cultural practice traveled along Islamic trade routes from farther east, and among these was a peculiar object, the wheel instrument, though at the time it was known by a different name, the symphonia. This instrument was peculiar not only because it used a wheel and a crank, but most of all because it was one of the few instruments that required two people to play it. One person would cradle the body of the instrument in their lap as they turned the crank, while the other would hold the key chest as they played melodies. These instruments were sometimes as long as 1.5 meters and would produce deep pitches described as soft and sweet by those who enjoyed it. Others, however, were not so impressed, and when it was criticized, it was common to hear it described as loud and nasal. This instrument found particular popularity in the church, as it suited the often solemn music being practiced in it. The clunky mechanism meant that only slow melodies could be played on it, and the drone helped produce the halteton organum common to the church, in which one voice would hold a single note while the other would sing a melody over it, coming back to rest on the same note as the drone during pauses. The earliest depictions of this two-player symphonia exist on portals to churches in the 1100s, but it's almost certain that they have been a part of the culture of southern Spain for some time. Of all the places it was depicted, however, there is likely one place from which it spread all over Europe, the Shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, a popular destination for pilgrims during the Middle Ages. It became such a regular part of church music that, in the 1200s, it was given a name unique to the church, the organistrum, though this name was short-lived. But while the Symphonia was seeing use in Christian religious music, smaller versions were being created and used in secular music. Traveling performers took note of the unique sounds that the Symphonia could produce, but these people typically played as solo acts, and their instruments had to be portable, barring them from using the large two-person instrument. Despite this, the musical possibilities were too enticing to ignore, and so, another form of key was developed. The push key. These were unique in that they could not slide freely, but instead fit snugly in their keyholes. The player could push the key down to stop the string and leave it in place as they moved their hand to another key, enabling it to be played by a single person. These newer versions were also much smaller, sometimes taking the form of a box with all mechanical components hidden inside, and they quickly became a standard part of the minstrel's repertoire. Soon, it became so important that the troubadour Guiraut de Calanso listed it as one of the 9 instruments that a minstrel must learn, and Christian images of holy kings and angels would appear either alongside Symphonia players or playing the Symphonia themselves. With the popularity of the instrument growing, development of new mechanisms continued, and by the end of the late Middle Ages, the most efficient method of playing a melody was discovered: the sliding keys. These keys, rather than pulled or turned from the top, were pushed in from the bottom. While this made the player unable to see the keys they were pressing, the ability to play faster melodies and the ease with which they could be played made this variation of the instrument far preferable, and eventually it became the standard for symphonias all over Europe. But the high esteem of the instrument would not last, and soon it would decay from the highest echelons of society to the lowest. During the Middle Ages, physical handicaps were considered not only an impairment, but a reflection upon the soul of the person with them, and likewise, anything associated with the handicapped would be viewed as tainted. By the late 1300s, symphonias were beginning to pass from practiced musicians to blind beggars, and enough of them were playing symphonias that the sound of the instrument was irrevocably tied to their identity. This favor for the instrument was likely in part because of how simple it was to learn to play, due to the limited number of keys and the relative simplicity of turning a crank. However, with no means to maintain their instruments, along with limited ability and a small repertoire, the droning music that they produced was often warbled and repetitious. Changing temperature and humidity would warp the wheel, the keys would stick and bend in their keyholes, and strings would cease to hold their tuning. In Germany, where the instrument had inherited the name lyre, it became an epithet for cheap goods or annoying sounds. The word for a symphonia player, Leiermann, became a synonym for flies due to their buzzing drone, and the cheapest goods were given the prefix Leier in reference to the fact that it was all a blind Leiermann could afford. The one place in Europe where it did not lose so much importance was France, where it would still be played by higher-class musicians. The Symphonia was also favored by begging instrumentalists who traveled between cities and rural towns, contributing to the loss of status, and it's possible that beggars began to earn more money even than poor minstrels. As such, minstrels would sometimes turn to beggars, erasing the boundary between the two. By the time the Symphonia reached Eastern Europe, it was solely in the capacity of an instrument used for begging. Compounded with this was another issue in the late Middle Ages. Due in part to the frequent wars and the number of men who joined the clergy, there were significantly more women than men in every stratum of society. However, women were generally disallowed from most forms of making money, and since there weren't enough men to marry, their opportunities were limited. Many took to traveling, acting as artists and performers, and a favorite instrument of these women was the symphonia. These women, however, were regarded lowly, and so the status of the instrument deteriorated further. Even as the instrument passed into the hands of beggars, minstrels were still traveling with it and playing at public events, but this practice would not last. Traveling musicians would often undercut local musicians, and so the latter formed unions to petition their local governments in order to protect their incomes from the travelers. One of the demands they made was to limit where these travelers could play, allowing only local musicians to play at the highest-paying venues. With these measures came a division of kinds of music, and as the symphonia was a traveler's instrument, it became limited to and associated with the commoners in poorer areas. These traveling musicians also had bad reputations, referred to as having a careless way of life, and as their station lessened, so too did their appearances in higher-class social events. Where the symphonia had once been a common sight at festivals, it now was only seen in the poorest places. Despite all of this, the symphonia remained an important part of the folk music traditions of each country, with each area crafting its own versions of the instrument. Though the body usually retained a guitar shape, other aspects differed, especially the number of strings, the number of keys, the size of the wheel, and the tuning. At some uncertain point, the trompet string was added as well, allowing the player to keep a rhythm with a buzzing bridge. This association with the poor did not degrade the instrument's reputation uniformly, and it was regarded differently at different times and in different places. With such variation came new names for the instrument depending on its location. Its German name was Lyre, while in France it was given the name viol after the old violin-like instrument with the same name fell out of fashion, and in England it received the unceremonious name Hurdy Gurdy. The true origins of this last name are unknown and subject to widespread speculation. Some posit that it is a bastardization of the phrase hurly-burly, referring to disorder and loud noise, while others claim it to be an onomatopoeic expression to describe the motion of someone shaking their bottom, as it was a dance instrument. Sometimes, different regions would have different words for the same instrument, and while it appears there is...
If it looks like I'm not really... I'm just kind of like watching and just kind of like taking this all in, it's because, well, I am. I'm absolutely fascinated. It's a story of medieval Europe going back from the 8th century, and here we are, and I think like the 15th century I think we're up to right now. And this is just... It's remarkable that this thing had such a great journey through history.
There's been no official tally, there may be dozens of unique names. But while its association with the blind did not entirely erode its stature in certain places, its popularity and reputation in Europe was irrevocably tarnished. Notably, it was included in the famous Hieronymus Bosch painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, from around the year 1500, where the Symphonia was included in the rightmost panel depicting hell, alongside a bagpipe. The instrument was also associated with begging children, often referred to as Savoyards, whether they were from Savoy or not, who would sometimes have a marmot on their shoulder to attract attention. The complicated station of the instrument was described in a 1636 work by Marin Mersenne, saying, quote, "If men of rank played the viol as a rule, it would not be regarded with such contempt, but because it is played only by the poor, and particularly by blind men who earn their living from this instrument, it is held in less esteem than others, but then it is not as pleasing." End quote. What Mersenne couldn't have expected, however, was the radical transformation that the instrument would undergo in less than a century. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, the leisure practices of the French aristocracy were undergoing significant changes. For some time, it was considered unsuitable for those of high station to attempt to master an instrument, as it was less important than their duties as an aristocrat, and that such mastery should be left to the lower classes. An anonymous letter in a French newspaper of the time read, quote, "It can indeed be permitted under normal conditions to devote oneself to music and to instruments to a certain point, that is to say, as much as is necessary to make oneself agreeable in society and to obtain entries into the social world. But for the nobility, they must be occupied with a broader outlook. They are accountable to their country, to the names they carry, and to the talents of an altogether different importance." End quote. This outlook didn't stop some aristocrats from acquiring and learning to play the more difficult instruments, such as the flute and the violin, to perform with and for each other privately. However, many of the instruments proving popular were not deemed suitable for women due to how unladylike they looked when playing them, while instruments that rested on the lap like the guitar and lute had gone out of style. This relegated them to instruments typically used only for accompaniment, such as the harpsichord. Therefore, if women were to perform in duets or as a soloist while maintaining decorum, another instrument would be required, and they would find it in the newly christened viol. Around that time, a new form of symphonia had been created that closer resembled the modern hurdy-gurdy, with multiple melody strings tuned to separate notes and made more compact while retaining its full range, making it more suitable to the upper class. This instrument, critically, could be placed on the lap while it was played, and required no motions considered unseemly for a woman. Soon, it became a standard part of the French repertoire for both men and women. This instrument gained quick popularity in part for two reasons. First, a new fad had taken hold of the aristocracy at the time, the pastoral ideal. Much in the same way that modern people think of pirates as lackadaisical and fun sailors, aristocrats thought of peasants as living a simple, relaxing life, herding cattle and roaming the hillsides. Included in this image was the viol, having never left the folk traditions of the French peasantry, and with the aristocracy idealizing all folk traditions during this time, the viol seemed quaint and fun. The second reason was the popularity of another instrument of the time, a variant of the bagpipe called the musette. Like the viol, it had a set of drones, and it also had a range very similar to that of the viol, with the viol only having a smaller range by a few diatonic notes. As such, it was often simple for violists to play parts written for the musette on the viol instead. The demand for viols was suddenly high. Composers quickly set to writing music that included the viol, a task made particularly difficult due to the inclusion of the drone strings, which were seen as a vital part of its sound. Likewise, luthiers began experimenting with the form to improve upon it. But it would be one man in particular who would revolutionize the instrument into the form that has come to be the standard for the last 300 years. Around the year 1716, an instrument craftsman named Henri Baton was struggling to keep up with the massive demand for viols, much like his contemporaries. What's more, the guitar and lute had lost popularity only recently, leaving him with a large surplus of unused bodies for each. Looking to not waste completed work and materials, and desperate to meet demand, he began using these leftover bodies to construct new viols, experimenting and improving upon the design until settling on the 6-string model that would become the standard for French instruments, though only 5 would be used at a time, with 3 drones and both melody strings. He also would add flourishes such as elaborately carved headstocks and trimming. These changes firmly established the viol as a court instrument. Despite this standardization, however, it was rare for 2 viols to look alike, with intricate ornamentation, varying body shape, and even tonal experiments such as greater melody ranges. The only instruments in greater demand were the harpsichord, the flute, and the violin. Even so, the viol maintained an unsavory reputation as being the instrument of choice for fashion chasers. In a French novel from 1744, author Jean-Baptiste Jourdan describes just this kind of person. As translated by Robert A. Greene, quote, She is found at all the parties, does not miss a restaged opera, a new play, a day of excitement. She must stay in bed for the slightest imposition, constantly complain about her color or the lack of vivacity in her eyes, the negligence of her adornment, have the vapors on command, oh, an essential article, speak Italian, play the viol, drink champagne, finally, laugh, sing, never be on time, and go to bed at 4 a.m. End quote. But this popularity...
I don't even think, even if you were to pay me to do that, I don't think I could do that. No, not you would have to pay me a lot of money for me to even think about that. Go to bed at 4, like, that's insane.
Would prove relatively short-lived. The sound and respectability of the viol was closely tied with the viol, as both its playing technique and tonal ideals were based on it, and the latter reached its peak of popularity in 1720. While the value of the viol had been in question from its inception all throughout its lifespan in France, the changing tastes of the aristocracy would see the instrument almost entirely abandoned by 1760, relegating it once again to the rural regions of France. But the lowest point of the instrument was yet to come.
French Revolution.
In 1789, the French Revolution marked a moment of extreme and far-reaching social disruption. Myriad failed reforms and poor decisions by the French government had led to food shortages, massive governmental debt, and widespread social discontent, leading to a period of French history known as the Reign of Terror. Over the course of a year, beginning in 1793, approximately 300,000 people were arrested and 17,000 people were executed under the newly invented guillotine, and according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, up to another 10,000 died awaiting trial. But the instigators of the revolution surmised that simply removing or executing those in positions of leadership was insufficient to completely abolish sentiment towards the monarchical system, and so they set about destroying symbols of their rule, including paintings, sculptures, buildings, and musical instruments. While the viol had fallen out of fashion long before the French Revolution, many instruments were still housed in the great mansions of the aristocracy, and they were confiscated, catalogued, then frequently destroyed. Very few of these instruments survived. Once again, the viol was relegated to the countrysides of central France, where a tradition was maintained. Notably, they would be played during public ceremonies, especially weddings. The instruments made in the aftermath of the French Revolution were often made to a similar specification as those for the aristocracy, in part because the most famous makers, named the Pageaux, had ties to the old royal French court, and so, in France, these improved instrument designs first imagined by Henri Baton would survive. But in the rest of Europe, the sinfonia would continue its tradition as a beggar's instrument, to the point that music and literature would see sinfonia players and beggars as synonymous. One of the most famous instances of this is the German song Der Leiermann. It describes an old man outside a village, barefoot on the ice in the winter, perpetually cranking his lyre with an empty plate in front of him, as dogs growl at him. France became one of the final places with a regular folk tradition for the sinfonia, but eventually, this too would begin to disappear in the early 1900s as interest in folk music traditions gradually evaporated. But unexpectedly, in the 1960s and 70s, interest increased in both Europe and America, and this interest included the viol in France. There were still a few old practitioners of 1800s folk music to teach it to this new, interested generation, and through these people, a living tradition of folk music could continue. From this group of players also came a new group of craftspeople. At first, this population was chiefly located in France and attempted to imitate Henri Baton's viol from the 1700s, but over time, different workshops in Europe sought to recreate the sinfonias from their respective regions. This, however, proved challenging, as in most places, the traditions of playing and crafting were completely dead, with no living practitioners remaining to teach a new generation. As such, they began to perform research into what historical work had been done on the instrument, consulting works of visual art and method books in order to construct modern facsimiles. By this point, however, the name Symphonia had largely died out, and while it is known by its many local names, most people around the world will still recognize it as the Hurdy Gurdy. It began to appear in popular culture in minor ways, most notably the aforementioned song Hurdy Gurdy Man by Donovan. Renaissance fairs also saw regular appearances by the hurdy-gurdy as a period-accurate instrument, while over the decades, craftspeople improved upon the design by degrees, experimenting with capos, body shapes and constructions, tunings, the number of strings, remote switches, and various other changes to help improve the sound and make playing easier. Today, the sound of the hurdy-gurdy is usually used to evoke the medieval era or pirates, the latter due to the uneven sound of smaller, poorly maintained instruments and the scratchy playing of amateurs. Strangely, it also has become well known thanks to the folk metal band Eluveitie, who includes it as a standard part of its repertoire alongside...
Exactly, I just listened to this group a few days ago for the first time, and just look at that.
...the fiddle, tin flute, and bagpipes. Other modern composers and players will use its vast tone-producing possibilities in creative ways, especially when pickups are added, but these often ignore its droning qualities, either downplaying or removing them entirely to better fit modern musical expectations. Occasionally, a player such as Paddy Gurdy or Andrei Vinogradov will have one of their videos go viral on YouTube, introducing it to a new audience every time and growing its base of listeners and players. Rumors of uncertain origin exist in Germany that the instrument will sometimes bewitch people with its sound, causing them to become obsessed. Interest in the hurdy-gurdy has grown chiefly in Europe, with yearly festivals based around the instrument growing in both size and number as craftspeople continue to improve and iterate upon their designs. Many makers' styles have become so individualized that it's possible to discover who has made one simply by looking at it from the front. The level of craftsmanship required to make them, however, is remarkable due to the precision necessary to achieve a proper tone, but this challenge has only encouraged the most dedicated makers, and it's not uncommon for the more expensive hurdy-gurdies to cost upwards of $5,000 or $6,000. Waitlists are commonly over a year long. For some players, however, this price is well worth the cost, and they will often pursue its playing to extremes of dexterity. Certain aspects of the instrument have appeared in unexpected places as well. Recently, guitar maker Tony Dugan-Smith created a unique instrument designed to produce ambience for horror movies, which he named the Apprehension Engine, and conspicuously included is a hurdy-gurdy wheel. For now, however, the hurdy-gurdy occupies a peculiar niche in folk music, and many players and luthiers are not only willing, but eager to share their strange instrument with those who are willing to listen and learn, even though misinformation about its history is common. Though it remains a curiosity to the mainstream world, its small core of passionate players remain dedicated and enthusiastic, and this seems unlikely to change.
Jesus, guys, we just friggin' went through we went through just one giant history lesson about a musical instrument, dating from the Islamic kingdoms to Spain, and eventually works its way into France, and in the modern day. And you know what? I want to do more stuff like this. I want to do more videos about the history of musical instruments, because I never realized before how interested I got until the part where they got to about Jean Bouton, and the designs for some of these things looked absolutely amazing. I wonder exactly how elaborate you can make some designs for hurdy-gurdies, and exactly how far you can make the sound, or even that conductor thing, whatever it was, made out of the wheel out of a hurdy. In fact, you know what? Just to end this video, let's literally we'll just put on some music for about like 12 seconds. I'll put some music on for about a good like 25 or so seconds just to end this video off. So I'll just leave that for you guys to enjoy. So I hope all of you have enjoyed the history of the hurdy-gurdy by Down the Rabbit Hole. Please make sure to leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below. Let me know if you want me to do more videos about the histories of musical instruments. Because if that video was anything to go by, maybe the piano like the origins of where the piano came from. That might just be what I might be after next. We'll just have to wait and see. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and I'll leave you guys with this.